I'm calling to order this hearing. This is a public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. Technically, it's called a roundtable, an oversight roundtable. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chairman of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Today is Thursday, December 9th, 2021. We're starting a bit late at 10:38 in the morning. This hearing or roundtable is being conducted virtually, live via the Zoom video conference broadcast platform. I believe we're also being broadcast on cable television. I'm being told no, we're not. And but we are being recorded. And this is available live as well on the chairman's website, which is www.chairmanmendelson.com/live. The subject of this hearing, oversight hearing, is improving school attendance, truancy, and chronic absenteeism issues in the districts. The stated purpose of this oversight roundtable is to receive testimony from invited and government witnesses and partners, including the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, the Child and Family Services Agency, the District of Columbia Public Schools, the Public Charter School Board, and the Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants, regarding the district's efforts to improve school attendance and to reduce truancy and chronic absenteeism. While the district has worked to improve school attendance and lower truancy and chronic absenteeism rates over the past decade, much work still needs to be done. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated longstanding issues and impacted the district's ability to obtain representative attendance data over the past 2 school years. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. That is, it will close at 5 p.m. on December 23rd, 2021. Even though the witnesses were limited, anyone who wishes to submit comments is welcome to do so, invited to do so, encouraged to do so, and has 2 weeks to do so. This is the latest in a series of roundtables or hearings that the Committee of the Whole has had on this topic of attendance, truancy, and chronic absenteeism. However, the last hearing was, I believe, right before the pandemic, December of 2019. And it's been my view that with the distance learning last year, it was difficult to accurately discuss attendance from the perspective of kids being in the classroom, since classrooms weren't open last year for the most part. However, the data suggests that despite almost a decade of efforts focusing on reducing truancy, reducing chronic absenteeism, and increasing attendance, that we really haven't moved the needle very much. And there are several reasons why attendance or truancy, why these issues are important. One of them, the most obvious from an educational perspective, kids aren't in school, they're not learning. If they're not learning, then they're either going to drop out or they're going to be, what's it called, social promotion, falsely promoted when they're really not career college ready. And that's very problematic from an educational perspective. But it is also important to identify children who are at risk of, among other things, delinquency or other social problems, which correlates heavily with truancy. The idea here is not to punish truants, but rather to identify students who are missing a lot of school so that we can determine why they are missing, which often is something dysfunctional that's going on in their lives or in their home, and then to bring the appropriate services to address that dysfunction so that those kids get back in school. It's my view that we should be focusing on kids in the earliest grades, because for them, catching them early with absentee issues should have significant payoff in terms of getting them back into school, and they're succeeding through the 12 years of primary and secondary education. However, it's also evident that we need what I'll call a two-prong approach, which includes focusing on where truancy is and absenteeism is the highest, and that is in the upper grades. And we can't be focusing just on the upper grades, because then we will miss what I'll call pipeline of kids in the lower grades who are beginning to struggle, and by the time they get to high school are chronically absent. This is a complicated issue. A lot of effort and money has been put into this, but as I said, we're not moving the needle very well, and this hearing will be exploring what is going on and what we can do differently. With that, let me call the witnesses into the witness room. I don't know why I refer to it as room, since it's just a click on the laptop. But Will Henderson, who's Executive Director of Operations for the Paul Public Charter School. Rashida Young, who is Chief School Performance Officer at the Public Charter School Board. Dr. Christina Grant, who is the State Superintendent, Office of State Superintendent of Education, and congratulations for your confirmation on Tuesday of this week. Elizabeth Maffalito, who is Deputy Director of Entry Services at the Child and Family Services Agency. Michelle Garcia, who is Director of Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants. Dr. Amy Maestera, who is Deputy Chancellor at the District of Columbia Public Schools, and Paul Kine, who's Deputy Mayor for Education at the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education. I think what I will do is get testimony from each of you and then have questions. So this hearing could be a couple hours, and at the moment there are no other council members present. So we could have a very good conversation, and I hope we do. With that, Mr. Henderson from Paul Public Charter School, you are first. And good morning.
Good morning, and I'm hoping everybody is able to see me. I've just realized that I've had to rearrange where I keep my situation started. Good morning, Council. Thanks for allowing us the opportunity to share with you some of our experiences serving students in the District of Columbia. My name is Will Henderson. I'm the Executive Director of Operations at Paul Public Charter School, and I'm also a resident of Ward 4, which is the same community Paul PCS is located. Paul educates students in grades 6 through 12. We at Paul have 3 significant concerns I'd like to highlight that are making our ability to serve our students difficult. And I also want to accompany these concerns with what we believe is a simple solution that's good for students, good for public charter schools, and align with the greater aims of this council. Our 3 concerns are as follows. Current attendance policies do not allow or encourage us to discover creative ways to provide meaningful educational experiences to our scholars by all means necessary. DC health guidance reflects or conflicts with public health standards and inadvertently encourages schools to deprioritize public health and safety, which has ripple effects on vulnerable students that never step foot in vulnerable people that never step foot in the school building. And thirdly, some of these policies exacerbate learning loss rather than diminishing it by not providing us an opportunity to create and offer meaningful virtual instruction. The mission of any school leader and teacher might be summarized to be the following: providing young people a safe place to grow and engage in challenging learning experiences. The vast majority of school personnel enter this profession to pursue this aim by any means necessary. During the height of the pandemic last year, any means necessary meant virtually for the entire school year for most of us. At Paul, we met this challenge head on, and our students, while they missed us and their peers, saw gains in their academic experiences across almost all grade levels. We had synchronous learning provisions over Zoom and Google Meets every class period on camera almost every day. And we then spent the summer operationalizing these offerings so they would be sustainable in the coming year. Disappointingly, though, when we utilize those creative and effective measures for students that are virtual this year, we're not rewarded oftentimes. We do not get credit this year for in-seat attendance for those students, despite the fact that they are sitting in our classrooms virtually on a Zoom screen and are able to actively engage with their teacher of record and their peers. At Paul and at other charter schools, truancy is not actually the primary issue that we are facing. The attendance policies, while attempting to address truancy issues, actually exacerbate the problem of learning loss because it does not help us get students in front of their teachers in some form. Attendance has always been a strength at Paul. Prior to the pandemic, we consistently had over 90% in-seat attendance in both of our schools. We maintained the standard of excellence largely throughout the school year 2021 as well. Also, truancy was always at the front of our mind. Truancy, as defined formally, was always at the front of our mind as we struggled to get a handful of kids in front of their teachers and in our building prior to the pandemic. Fast forward to this year, 21-22, and truancy at Paul is actually at an all-time low. However, our in-seat attendance is lower than we've ever experienced historically. We are struggling to meet that 90% threshold every day in our schools, and we've never struggled with this in the past. Our evaluation of this is that due to the public safety concerns that COVID has rightly given all of us, our parents are eager to abide by DC health standards and they prove so by providing proper documentation for their children's absences. We can thus mark them absent excused, which then inevitably does not contribute to the truancy count. However, when these students are not with us, we do not get credit for in-seat attendance, regardless of whether we offer them whether or not we offer them educational opportunities. We at Paul are equipped to provide all of those children a synchronous experience in person on a Zoom screen with teacher and classmates in every type of class we have. During the height of pandemic, we scaled up our device fleet so that every child had their own Chromebook, and we equipped every classroom with a camera and a screen so that teachers and students could engage with one another virtually and live. The current policies do not give us credit for this. It assumes we will send students home with a packet and does not give us credit or reward us when we actually do provide creative solutions for instruction. Certainly, having these children in the building physically is a preference, but there are so many reasons why a child might need to be home. They have COVID. Someone in their home has COVID. They were considered a close contact to someone in the school and thus are quarantining according to DC health standards. They have unexplained symptoms, but that they are monitoring. Or they just are plain confused because of the competing information that comes between CDC, DC health, and other local news services, et cetera, and their parents are fearful. As it stands, the current attendance policy is worse than learning loss because we cannot find creative solutions to serve our kids, regardless of whether they are physically in person or virtually in person. If we are able to consider a child present when they are in a virtual classroom, we and our teachers will do all we could to provide those children and keep those children present and engaged with us, regardless of whether or not they are virtual. The reality here is true that we are forced to deprioritize this, despite that it is in conflict with all of our personal aims and missions. And this policy forces us to deprioritize it rather than encouraging us to prioritize that by being creative with by ensuring quality engagement with students by any means necessary. The policy only attends to truancy in its formal definition, something that is not the number one need at Paul PCS, and I presume elsewhere as well. The immediate impact of this policy is that it fixes the truancy problem, but creates a new problem. According to DC Health, many of our students are in fact required to be home and quarantining. Without an incentive for the school to provide a meaningful and rigorous instructional experience during the school day, one of the three things is likely to occur. One, a child is required to complete their work packets without necessary support from their instructors, waiting until they can be in person physically to get that support. Two, children are unsupervised and therefore able to make less positive choices as children and teenagers are wont to do. And three, parents may continue to be present and supervise their children, but are not able to provide appropriate supervision at home in quarantine. So the child goes with them wherever the parent goes and risks the public health of others not in the school building. In sum, the pandemic has changed education permanently, not temporarily. And we as school leaders must have the capability, the flexibility, the protection, and the incentivization to plan for that creatively. My recommendation, or Paul's recommendation, is that we allow us to track the attendance code of synchronous distance learning as a part of our in-seat attendance for anyone who we deem in need of distance learning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. And we don't have a copy of your statement. It'd be helpful if you gave it to us. Rashida Young. And good morning.
Yes. Good morning, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing on attendance and truancy. I am Rashida Young, Chief School Performance Officer for the DC Public Charter School Board. I would like to begin by recognizing all the hard work and creativity that has gone into keeping students engaged and attending school throughout the pandemic. From the first days of the school closures to the day schools reopened, school leaders, teachers, and staff have worked hard to connect families to resources so that all the challenges of the pandemic did not interfere with school attendance. I also want to recognize families who helped their students maintain strong attendance during distance learning. For so many students, especially the youngest ones, the extra support of their families made all the difference in their virtual education. Of course, there have always been barriers to students' attendance, such as family responsibilities, transportation issues, part-time jobs, and housing instability. The pandemic both created new challenges and in many ways exacerbated those we already faced. During the months of distance learning, a reliable internet connection and a working device were necessary for students to engage in lessons. And the in-person activities that provided extra motivation for students to attend school were no longer accessible. Our schools have been working to address both recruiting and new challenges to attendance, recurring and new challenges to attendance. They leverage community partnerships and resources available to families, and many teachers and school support staff go the extra mile to provide individualized support. We know there is diversity among our schools and our families, which means that addressing chronic absenteeism and truancy requires a variety of strategies and not a one-size-fits-all solution. Due to the unique challenges of the pandemic and distance learning, we anticipated in-seat attendance would be lower and truancy would be higher in school year 2020-21. And as we expected, in-seat attendance decreased by 3.9 percentage points to 88.4%, excluding adult schools, compared to school year 2019-20. The truancy rate increased from 26.8% in school year 18-19, which was the last full school year that we had data prior to the pandemic, to 35.6%. While these rates are concerning, we recognize that last school year was unlike any other, and therefore likely an outlier in terms of student attendance. We are confident that schools went above and beyond their usual work to try to engage students who struggled to consistently attend school virtually. When broken down, the data reveals some interesting trends. Elementary schools saw the largest decline in attendance, from 92.7% to 86.2%, which could be attributed to lack of routines or, for many students, reliance on family to navigate technology to access school. On the other hand, high schools saw a slight increase in attendance from 91.9% to 92.3%. We expect this is because older students were better able to use technology and appreciated schedule flexibility. Schools spent the spring and summer evaluating what worked about distance learning for older students and thinking about how to better incorporate those aspects into classroom learning. Alternative and adult schools in particular leveraged the use of technology and schedule flexibility for their students who often have many more responsibilities outside of school. We also wanted to note an observation about attendance on Wednesdays throughout last school year. Many LEAs across the city opted to use asynchronous instruction each Wednesday rather than synchronous live instruction, making it more difficult to gauge student attendance on those days. For this reason, Wednesdays saw the largest decrease in in-seat attendance. The drop from 92.6% to 83.9% was most likely the result of this programmatic choice. We suspect that students either struggled to motivate themselves to participate on asynchronous learning days, or if they did not provide the documentation required to demonstrate that they were present and learning asynchronously. The challenges of virtual learning and attendance are why we continue to believe it is so important school buildings are open this year. We know this school year still presents unique challenges to attendance, such as ongoing concerns about COVID safety, unprecedented disruptions to Metro Rail service, and navigating quarantine guidance. However, public charter schools remain prepared to address these issues and have been working diligently and creatively all year to boost attendance rates. Charter LEAs and DC PCSB are also working to understand which of last year's attendance and truancy data points were outliers due to virtual learning and which may continue to impact education for months or years to come. We are also working to understand which lessons can be leveraged in service of students in the future, such as the promising trend among high school students. Our schools have shown and continue to show a commitment to re-engaging students and increasing attendance above pre-pandemic levels. They consistently find different and innovative ways to ensure in-seat attendance improves in a meaningful way. DCPCSB, LEAs, and our partners across the district, including the DME, OSSE, and DCPS, are committed to coming out of the pandemic stronger than before. We are collaborating in order to see that through. Thank you for allowing me to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Young. Dr. Grant.
Good morning, and Chairman Mendelson. Thank you for the acknowledgement of my confirmation. I'm very thankful to serve in this role. Good morning, everyone. Members of the committee, staff. My name is Dr. Christina Grant, and for the first time, I am the State Superintendent of Education at the Office of the State Superintendent of Education in Washington, D.C. I'm pleased to appear before the Committee of the Whole for this public roundtable on student attendance. I'm also pleased to be joined by my colleagues in the education cluster, Deputy Mayor for Education, Paul Klein, the Chief School Performance Officer at the Public Charter School Board, Rashida Young, and the Deputy Chancellor of DC Public Schools, Amy Mastera. I'm also joined by Elizabeth, I'm going to say it wrong, Maffaletto. Did I get it right, Melissa? Oh, I'm so proud. Deputy Director of Entry Services for the DC Child and Family Services Agency. My colleagues join me to answer your questions after my prepared testimony on this critical topic. Attendance is important for student achievement, well-being, and overall success. Our children must attend school regularly in order for our investments in our schools to bear fruit. Unfortunately, chronic absenteeism and truancy hold back the academic achievements of far too many students. If children do not attend school regularly, then all of our collective efforts inside our school buildings to ensure a high-quality education are in vain. Chronic absenteeism and truancy rates in the District of Columbia before, during, and after the closure of schools due to COVID-19 continue to be a paramount concern for the Bowser administration, educators, myself, and members of this council. To tackle this pressing, persistent, and multifaceted problem, it will require cooperation across government and throughout our community. We have a role and responsibility of addressing this problem together. In my testimony, I will ground our discussion today by describing the policy approaches that we took in response to the pandemic to collect and report attendance data. I will also share key data takeaways on attendance and truancy from the Office of the State Superintendent's most recent report on the state of attendance for the 2020-21 school year. I will also share some preliminary numbers on attendance for the 2021-22 school year. I will conclude my testimony by providing some thoughts about focusing our intervention efforts. The 2020-21 school year began with our schools closed for in-person learning due to the public health efforts to protect the community from the COVID-19 virus. As we anticipated instruction being offered in both in-person and distance learning settings, OSSE believed that it was critical to collect attendance in a systemic way, irrespective of a student's instructional setting. The daily attendance collection is important for protecting a child's safety and welfare, and it is also required by local law. OSSE published guidance at the beginning of the 2020-21 school year on how attendance would be collected for both in-person and distance learning. Local statutes governing attendance did not change, so students of compulsory age were still required to attend school. Further, collection, reporting, and intervention requirements, such as notification to families, student support team meetings, and referrals to child welfare agencies for truancy, remained in place. Schools reported daily attendance, specifying in-person and distance learning postures. Students who attended school in person could be marked present or absent without consideration to the proportion of the school day of the student attended, meaning no application of the 80-20 rule, meaning there was no application of the 80-20 rule, which is a shift from past practice. For distance learning, students needed to satisfy a two-part test to be counted as present. The student's identity had to be authenticated, for example, by seeing their face on their learning platform or by signing into it, and the student had to meet a bar for engagement, for example, by submitting a work product or some other standard of student participation. LEAs defined their attendance policies and their continuous education plans for the 2021-22 school year. OSSE reviewed and approved these plans and shared them publicly on our website. For the 2021-22 school year, OSSE returned to our pre-pandemic methods for collecting and reporting attendance. Our policies accommodate both in-person and distance instruction. To attend school through distance learning, students must have a medical certification form or attend a school authorized as a distance learning school. Students may also attend school through distance learning if they are under quarantine or learning remotely due to public health guidance procedures. Schools must report attendance using established attendance codes delineating between in-person learning and distance learning. Distance learning codes are further delineated so we know if students are attending in school in distance learning and for what reason. OSSE released its annual attendance report on November 30th as required by local law. This report analyzes attendance data across all LEAs and public schools in the district to inform policy and practice. I will now share some of the key findings from this important report. Students attended 95% of school days through distance learning during the 2020-21 school year. Overall, distance learning did not improve attendance outcomes for students. In fact, chronic absenteeism rates were slightly higher in the 2020-21 school year than in previous years. In 2020-21 school year, chronic absenteeism rose to 31.1%, up from 30.2% in the 2018-19 school year. Truancy rose to 38.6%, up from 29.9% in the 2018-19 school year. We saw far more unexcused absences in 2020-21 school year than in previous school years, which led to an increase in truancy. Further, student groups with the highest rates of absenteeism, high school students, and particularly ninth graders, and those classified as at-risk, homeless, overage in high school, or who attended multiple schools, continue to show those trends in the 2020-21 school year. The OSSE attendance report anticipated curiosity and the impact that distance learning may have had on improving attendance for certain student groups and spends significant time analyzing this question. The data did show some notable variation in attendance between instructional settings for some student groups. Yet, it is important to not over-exaggerate the meaning of these trends in the data. For example, we saw that younger students were more likely to have higher in-seat attendance rates while going to school in person than their peers in virtual instruction. This intuitively makes sense because parents and guardians needed their children to be supervised during the day while they were at work, and schools provide that. Yet older students, especially those that were overage, were more likely to have higher in-seat attendance rates in distance learning. Figure 8 of the report shows that in-seat attendance in distance learning at 68% compared to 54% for in-person learning. This is a glimmer of light in the data, but we caution against making sweeping conclusions based on these findings. Although it's an interesting trend, more rigorous examination of the data is needed before any large-scale investments in expanding distance learning to support this group of students should take place. Specifically, although attendance could have improved through in-distance learning, it may have not led to improved academic outcomes. This may be a place for future examination by the Research Practice Partnership. Further, when we look at student subgroups along the lines of race and ethnicity, we did not see strong improvements in attendance rates by learning environment. In short, based on the data, we do not believe that distance learning is significantly the remedy to improving attendance and academic outcomes for our students, although we welcome rigorous research, especially around specific populations of students who have low attendance rates. As far as attendance data for the 2021-22 school year, we do have some preliminary data points to share with the committee today. As of November 29th, in-seat attendance across the district is at 85%. In-seat attendance for DCPS is at 88% and 82% for our public charter schools. These rates are consistent with prior years. Also, the majority of children are attending school in person on any given day, with nearly 1,100 out of approximately 90,000 students being coded as a distance learning state. The greatest proportion of that group of students are in distance learning due to a situational need. For example, a temporary need to quarantine or have remote learning due to public health guidance. OSSE's attendance reports have been very clear about providing some directionality about where LEAs and schools can focus their intervention efforts. Here are a few key takeaways from those reports that may be helpful toward targeting our efforts. We are grateful to our LEAs, leaders, and our school leaders who are working hard every day to address attendance needs based on the needs of their students and their communities. First, a student's prior record of attendance is a harbinger of their future attendance. It is important to not wait until a student has already missed too many instructional days and then try to intervene. We must reach out as early as possible. It's important that our interventions, particularly our approach to student support team meetings and student and family outreach, which my colleagues will speak to at the LEA level, are set up proactively to respond to student absenteeism and not just to react to it. Second, it is important to direct more attention to where the data already shows attendance worsens, particularly in ninth grade and amongst ninth grade repeaters. It's important that schools focus on their re-engagement efforts with ninth grade students and families, and that students who repeat ninth grade receive even more intensive plans, engagement, and support. That's why OSSI's work in the Bridge to High School Data Exchange is important. Through this effort, OSSI facilitates the sharing of student-level data between the students sending middle school and they're receiving high school, so that high schools can intervene with their incoming ninth graders quickly, securely, and consistently. Third, we also see that chronic absenteeism is at its lowest in the beginning of the school year, but begins to rise in the spring and peak at the end of the year. This trend is same and true for truancy. It's important that schools redouble efforts in the waning months and weeks of school so that time is as important and meaningful to students in the first months and weeks of school. Fourth, system-level cross-sector solutions are also important. Attendance is a multifaceted issue without easy solutions, but it is all of our responsibility. Some of the most significant barriers for our students are more systemic and structural in nature and not related to the education sector. Yet we recognize that we are all in this difficult work together as a city. For example, the investments that we make in public safety and enforcement of our laws keep our students safe on their way to and from school. The city's efforts to address housing stability have been laudable, and stable housing means less mobility from school to school, which has clearly been tied to higher levels of absenteeism. And having a reliable and safe public transportation system is important. Two, along with efficient transportation services from OSSI and innovative transportation pilots that have taken place with the Department of For-Hire Vehicles and other safe passage initiatives. School efforts are critical, and we are working our hardest to improve, but system-level efforts are critical as well in addressing this pressing problem. Finally, we must continue to set high expectations for students and their families for regular school attendance. Attendance is a family, school, and community responsibility, and we must work together to ensure our students are safe, engaged, and ready to learn. In closing, I too want to recognize the hard work of our LEAs in schools to engage and support our students who continue to rise to meet this challenge. Again, addressing this critical problem of student attendance requires the cooperation and the collaboration of all of us, policymakers, school officials, community, parents, and students. It's a problem that does not lend itself to easy solutions and requires collective effort. I hope that the data we've provided to you in our annual attendance report is helpful to that effort. My colleagues and I look forward to engaging in the conversation with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. Elizabeth Muffaletto.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Chairman Mendelson, council members, and staff. I am Elizabeth Muffaletto, and I serve as the Deputy Director of Entry Services for the DC Child and Family Services Agency. I appreciate the opportunity to provide an update regarding CFSA's activities around addressing chronic absenteeism and supporting schools across the District of Columbia in improving school attendance. CFSA has partnered with the Office of the State Superintendent for Education, DC Public Schools, and the DC Public Charter School Board to create school year 2021-2022 operational guidance for all local education agencies. This document outlines the processes DC public schools, public charter schools, private schools, and CFSA will undertake this school year in response to concerns about students ages 5 to 13 who miss 10 or more full unexcused school days from virtual learning, in-person learning, or a combination of both. This partnership between the district's education and child welfare agencies consists of close, regular collaboration. On a monthly basis, we hold monthly check-in meetings with representatives from DCPS and DCPCSB to discuss attendance data, reporting figures, and the impact the operational guidance has on educators' efforts to mitigate attendance issues for the district students and families. This year, we implemented a new strategy to support school-based attendance staff through the launch of CFSA's virtual office hours. On a weekly basis, staff from any LEA has access to the supervisor of the Educational Neglect Triage Unit supervisor, and they can ask questions about the educational neglect reporting and investigation processes. Staff can also vocalize concerns about attendance issues with students within their school community and get recommendations for next steps. CFSA continues to receive reports of educational neglect and conduct its intake process via the Child Protective Services Administration. CFSA employs a specialized unit of social workers with the job responsibility of partnering with CFSA's Triage unit and DC schools to investigate reports of educational neglect. This unit facilitates improved communication with schools and engagement with families to identify the underlying issues that result in children and youth not consistently attending school. In addition to these staff members, through funding provided by the American Rescue Plan Act, CFSA was granted 4 additional resource development specialist positions to strengthen the agency's capacity to process referrals and work with families. As the agency's Human Resource Administration works through the hiring process, once onboarded, these RDSs will primarily work in the community with schools conducting wellness checks, locating and engaging parents and guardians, and connecting families to resources that help remove attendance barriers for their children. CFSA is committed to being a strong member of the district's team for addressing absenteeism amongst our learners. In conclusion, CFSA appreciates your interest and oversight on this important issue, and we look forward to strengthening our partnerships across systems to improve attendance outcomes and reduce educational neglect for our children and families. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Muffaletto. Michelle Garcia.
Good morning. Before I begin, I will note my testimony has 2 minor updates to what you have in front of you, and we have sent a revised version of this testimony to your staff.
And how can I, which is revised?
I will point out the 2 places it's revised as I go through. It's 2 small numbers. Good morning, Chairman Mendelson, council members and staff. My name is Michelle Garcia, and I'm the Director of the Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in today's Oversight Roundtable to discuss OVSJG's efforts to reduce student truancy in elementary, middle, and high schools in the district. Since OVSJG was last before you on this topic, we experienced unprecedented adjustments to schooling due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And while most students and teachers are now back in the classroom, we know that the attendance barriers that existed for students and families prior to the pandemic still pose challenges for many families, and in some cases were exacerbated by the pandemic. I want to express my sincere gratitude to all the teachers, school personnel, education leaders, and everyone who has worked throughout the pandemic to provide learning opportunities to students. I'm grateful to the 9 community-based organizations funded by OVSJG to provide services to students and families to reduce truancy for how quickly they responded to the emerging and continued needs of students and families due to the pandemic. When schools closed in March 2020, the grantees shifted to address the needs of students and families in a new remote learning environment and address needs that arose because of the pandemic. This included providing families with PPE, school supplies, desks for students, and in some cases, food for families who became food insecure. The CBOs aided families in accessing internet services, securing tablets, laptops, and hotspots offered by schools, and in connecting to other services and supports, including mental health services, housing and employment supports, financial literacy programs, and educational and parenting supports. Tragically, it also included linking families to burial assistance programs when a family lost a loved one due to COVID-19. Grantees assisted students and parents in using and troubleshooting technology. They held online family enrichment workshops for students and parents and created online support spaces for parents. One CBO created a virtual education program to support students ages 10 to 15 with developing reading and comprehension skills. The program provided incentives for students to participate and included social emotional components, which was very important as the youth were isolated due to the COVID restrictions. One CBO offered learning hubs, physical spaces where students could come and be supported while engaging in remote learning. As schools reopened, CBOs supported families in transitioning back, including assistance with uniforms and relaying information regarding health and safety measures schools have put into place. While schools have returned to in-person learning, the processes for referring students who have accrued 5 unexcused absences to the Show Up Stand Out program have not been fully reestablished. While CBOs have been funded this year to provide 74 programs, 59 elementary school and 15 middle school programs at 53 DC public schools and 7 charter schools, all have reported that many of the schools that they work with are not providing referrals for all of the students who are eligible for referral, that the referral rates are low overall, and that a small number of schools have not made any referrals yet this school year. Looking at similar periods over 3 years, we see that referrals have not yet returned to pre-pandemic levels. From August 26, 2019 to November 29, 2019, there were 871 referrals. From August 31st, 2020 through November 27th, 2020, there were 522 referrals. August 30th, 2021 through November 26, 2021, there were 582 referrals. Additionally, while we have a data sharing agreement with the Office of the State Superintendent of Education to access student data in CLIC, OSSI's data visualization application, and the system used by OSSI to collect education data from publicly funded District of Columbia LEAs and schools, that allows us and the CBOs to see the number of unexcused absences by student. This data has not yet been populated for the 2021-2022 school year. We recognize that school and education personnel are juggling many demands and are working closely with DCPS and the DC Public Charter School Board to improve referral rates and with OSSI to access data. And I want to thank all 3 for their ongoing collaboration and support. OVSJG also supports a high school truancy reduction program with 2 grantees providing programming in 5 high schools. This is one of the updates to what you have in front of you. In school year 2021, the program expanded to 4 middle schools, that's the second update, that serve as feeders to the program high schools. Performance data for the high school program continues to be positive. In school year 2020 to 2021, analysis of surveys assessing student attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors related to attendance and truancy showed that average scores improved between the baseline and post surveys on 10 out of 14 measures. Also in school year 2019 to 2020, the most recent year for which we have data, referred students that engaged in services demonstrated significantly higher in-seat attendance than non-engaged students, 67% versus 56%, and lower average unexcused absences, 6.47 versus 12.44. While the high school, middle school program saw a decline in referrals during the time classes were remote, the number of referrals has steadily increased as in-person learning resumed. This year, as of December 3rd, 2021, 230 students have been referred and 171 or 74% have been engaged in services. Finally, I would like to note that OVSJG just received a $1.5 million 5-year award to address truancy from the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Funds will support expansion of the Department of Human Services Parent and Adolescent Support Intensive Case Management program that works with youth who commit status offending behaviors, including truancy, running away, and extreme disobedience. The expanded work of PASS ICM will specifically focus on targeting the district's largest category of status offending youth, those who are chronically truant from school and thereby at risk for system involvement. The program will deliver intensive case management, care coordination, family engagement supports, mentoring supports, and tutoring supports to identified youth. I appreciate the council's efforts to improve school attendance in the district and look forward to continuing to work with you on these initiatives. I'm available to address your questions at this time.
You're on mute.
Okay, yes, I see that. Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Dr. Maestera.
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson. I actually do not have formal testimony. I'm here to support with questions you may have.
Okay. Why would DCPS not have a statement?
Chairman Mendelson, I will loop back on that. Understand the question and I'm certainly happy to support questions and discussion.
All right, I don't think that was an answer. Mr. Kine, Deputy Mayor Kine.
Chairman Mendelson, you will be disappointed to learn I also don't have a formal statement and piece of testimony. I'm sorry this is coming as a surprise to you. We had understood that OSSI would deliver primary testimony from the executive agencies, and we are here to engage in discussion and respond to questions.
Well, I did think that OSSI's testimony was comprehensive and good, but Deputy Mayor, the Truancy Task Force is under your office, not OSSI, and so you are in a position, that's just one example, to speak to that. I would have expected a statement. In regard to DCPS, similarly, just as the Charter School Board thought, and they've actually been very constructive at almost every one of these hearings over the years with their statement that DCPS, which is half of our kids, would have a statement.
Chairman, I think we'll have to loop back on the communication here because I had understood we had discussed this and communicated with your office. Both DCPS and I would have been extremely pleased to provide a statement, and we thought we were adopting a different approach for this roundtable. So please accept my apologies, and we will ensure that kind of miscommunication or breakdown doesn't happen in the future.
Okay. So let me pick up on a couple of things that I heard in the statements, the testimony that's been given. One of them was that OSSI has, I guess their data program for attendance is called CLIck, and that the data for the current school year has not yet been uploaded in CLIck. Dr. Grant, can you speak to why?
Apologies, I still can't seem to take myself off mute. I'm searching that, I'm looking for that information from the team right now. It's my understanding that because we've collected and operationalized attendance codes for that year, we're working to get it available. Michelle, I will follow up with you directly on that by close of business today. We know that the dashboard is live and it's loaded with all of the data from the 2020-21 school year, but I will make sure that we follow up on why data has not been loaded for students this year.
And let me just clarify, I wasn't speaking to the entire dashboard. I was speaking to the section. I don't know about the entire dashboard. The section that we have access to, no data has been populated in that particular area. I can't speak to the entire dashboard.
All right, Chairman, in direct answer to your question, I will follow up both with you and with Ms. Garcia to ensure that she has access. The way the dashboard is set up, there are different permissions and settings depending on the user. And so I just need to make sure that Ms. Garcia has access to the data that she needs to operationalize her work.
And Chairman Mendelson, we have been in contact with the OSSI staff and they are working to address this issue. They've indicated that there is a technological issue and they will hope to have it addressed shortly.
But of course, this is December 9th, and so we're well into the school year, and we're having a hearing today, and this should have been an issue as of a couple months ago. But related to this is that I hear comments from at the school level that schools don't have what I'll call robust access to CLIck. So my understanding is that OSSI provides monthly reports to schools. But if somebody, let's say the educational leader at a school wants to sort of look in between and maybe, I don't know to what extent the data can be manipulated, and I mean that in a data way, not in a bad way, that the school doesn't have that kind of access. Do you know, Dr. Grant?
That is a first for me to hear. Not only have we used CLIck here, I've used it for most of my career, LEAs should have access, and Dr. Mastera, please confirm, but LEAs should have access to the data for their LEA level, and depending on the multiple sites they may have, they should have access for each of the schools, and then they should be able to cut the data, frame the data. I'm trying to be mindful of words that would allow them to see grade bands, specific grades, specific subgroups, so that they could look at how the data trends are playing out. So it's a first to hear to me that schools would have that issue, but I would say each LEA has an OSSI technical liaison that actually helps support their ability to use this dashboard and understand the trends as they set forth. But I would want to quickly touch base with Dr. Mastera and even Ms. Young at the Charter Board, if you all are hearing the same concerns. If this bears out, we will ensure that we're providing more technical guidance, but this is the first time that I'm hearing of challenges with the actual dashboard.
Thank you, Superintendent Grant. For DCPS, we actually manage a data dashboard that provides all of the slices of data that Dr. Grant mentioned at the student, school, cluster, and system level. It is called the DCPS Data Analysis Center. And it is a very robust dashboard, as I noted, where everyone in the system can see this, what the trends are looking like, and also be able to dig into the data in some deeper ways, which we've built out this year and we're really excited about.
So for DCPS, are you saying, Dr. Mastera, that the data is available on a school level?
Absolutely. It's available at the student level. Any way that we need to slice it, and really appreciate the hard work of our teams building it out. We also now are capturing root cause challenges so that we can pull from those student conferences that we have at the 5-day mark, the data related to the underlying issues that families report. And then we use that to incorporate that into our multi-tiered system of support process and meet weekly, again, to look at that rich data that we have.
But this is, just to be clear, this is accessed by an individual school. The school leader or some other official at a school can access, they don't have to go through you to get the data. They can go directly to the portal and manipulate that data in ways that is useful to them.
Yes, correct. All administrators and attendance points of contact have direct access to the data, as do our instructional superintendents and senior leadership, and they can go directly to the dashboard at any moment in time, and it is refreshed daily.
What about on the charter school side? Ms. Young?
Yes, it's the same for the charter LEAs. They have access to their own school's data. We also have staff that review the data and make sure that schools are submitting their daily attendance, and we work with each school's liaison at OSSI if there's any sort of technical issue that they may have. But it's my understanding that all the charter LEAs do have access this year and can see their data in real time.
Well, this issue of the schools hearing back, because that's really what I'm pursuing here. Also, I hear this with regard to CFSA. So schools will do their referrals to CFSA, but then they hear nothing back. And I get that there could be some privacy issues, but the complete absence of feedback seems to be problematic. Ms. Muffaletto?
Yes, good morning. That we actually have a feedback system in which when a report is made to the portal, the reporter is given, is emailed back the decision that is made on that referral. So I'm not sure where that information came from because we have an automatic feedback loop.
We're not hearing that at all. Give me just a second.
Okay.
Chairman, if I can try to clarify, we sometimes hear that from school leaders, but
Yes.
school leader is not always the person who's the reporter. So the way CFSA works, in the general instance, the reporter gets the feedback back from CFSA. We've also introduced this year, which Liz can talk about, a new system whereby the COVID-related work that we're doing with CFSA gets reported back to the leader and the reporter. So there are now two tracks. The leaders will hear about the COVID-related matters, but the others all still go back to the original reporter.
That is correct.
Hold on, just give me a second. Well, who would the reporter be if not the school leader? In most of these instances.
So
About-
oh, sorry, I'm
We're
sorry.
talking about several thousand reports over the course of a year. And I would assume that most of those reports are coming from the school.
They are coming from the school, but it's not the school leader. It's generally the person who's in charge of the attendance. And each LEA has a different designee for the attendance.
Okay, so why are you able to report to the school leader for COVID, but not for attendance?
So we have specific guidelines as it relates to COVID-19 related referrals, in which once CFSA has assessed the safety and well-being of the family, if it is solely a COVID-19 related issue, then CFSA assists the family with the COVID-19 referral and refers back to the school reporter and the leader per the guidance that was created with CFSA, OSSI, the charter schools, and DCPS. It's specific guidance to COVID-19 related.
And similar guidance doesn't exist with regard to absenteeism. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. There's different guidance as it relates to non-COVID-19 related referrals.
Okay. Well, it may not be on CFSA or on you alone, but why is this good? Did we have two different policies? And if we think it's good enough for school leaders to know, all I know is that for years, when I've had these hearings, I've heard complaints that the school leaders don't know what happened. They send their cases and then they don't hear anything.
So the guidance is specific to the COVID-19 related absences because the school leader needs to help make the recommendation or the approval or denial of distance learning for those specific cases.
Okay, that's a reason, but that's not a reason why we're not.
So each LEA has a different school leader, and as part of the portal process, it's an automatic so that we're doing it in real time, letting the reporter know what happens with that specific referral. And the reporter would then be responsible to let the school leader know.
Chairman, I would be very happy to take up this question with Liz and the director of CFSA to see what's possible in terms of a broader feedback loop to the school, if you'd like us to investigate that further on the non-COVID-19.
I totally want to investigate it. This is this issue of the feedback is important enough because it's come up at several hearings that I can ask you without looking at my notes, but these are the notes I was given. One of the issues I repeatedly hear is that school leaders don't know what happens once a case is referred to CFSA, as CFSA cites privacy issues. For example, once a case is referred to CFSA, LEAs have no idea whether a student and his or her family has received assistance. If the school needs to provide more assistance, they don't know whether they should or whether CFSA is still involved. Without violating a family's privacy, what can be done to ensure more collaboration and coordination between LEAs and CFSA? Now, that was given to me largely in terms of LEAs, but I think it comes down to the school leader, which could be the principal or maybe someone else senior in the school, knowing what's going on with Johnny, who's missed a bunch of days, who's been reported to CFSA. And
Yeah, Chairman, I will be glad to look into that. I would push back in a very friendly and collaborative way on the general assertion that quote unquote schools don't know what's going on, given that the CFSA triage unit, which initially receives the case referrals, immediately reach out to the reporter and begin working with that person. They investigate what's happening at the school. They talk to the family. In other words, they adopt a very supportive role that allows them to understand the circumstances for that individual child. And they do touch base with the school as part of that overall investigatory work. So it may be true that quote, school leader doesn't know, but it's for sure true that the reporter is involved in the investigation.
And Chairman, if I may, just to add to what the Deputy Mayor shared from the perspective of DCPS, we do receive at the school level feedback regarding the status of the referral and whether essentially it was accepted or denied as an educational neglect circumstance. It may be that what is being raised up is that for the school, it would be, of course, welcome to have more information about context and also any recommended interventions. And that is the work we are engaging on with CFSA now to really try to build that out while adhering to the privacy, very important privacy requirements for the family, given the sensitivity of the circumstances we encounter.
Well, that's exactly along the lines of what I was trying to get at here. But hearing back that the referral was sustained as educational neglect or not is not enough information. And if Johnny is missing classes because Johnny's older brother was murdered last month, the principal needs to know more, because then the principal can provide more supports to the kid, to Johnny in school. And if all it is sustained or not, that doesn't tell the principal anything. I think, Dr. Maestera, you were in that direction. I don't know if you were going as far as me.
Yes, exactly. I think that's what we're working on is looking at how we can maintain the privacy and confidentiality. And of course, you know, with FERPA and all of the other important privacy laws that are in place for families, while also gleaning a bit more information. And I think that's, you know, that's it's a needle to thread, right? And it takes, and it should take some nuanced planning and calibrating between agencies. And that is the work that's underway now.
And how long will that work take? And maybe that's more of a rhetorical question, because this issue of information sharing with CFSA has been an issue for at least a decade. And easy and quick to say, well, FERPA and HIPAA to prevent sharing of information. Sometimes that's more easily said than is actually the legal reality. And if it's local law, we can certainly address local law if there needs to be information sharing. But I don't know how we educate kids if we don't take a whole approach. And the whole approach.
Absolutely, yes.
If something's happening in Johnny's family that is the reason why Johnny's not coming to school, let's tell the school folks so that they can help Johnny.
Right, absolutely in agreement. And I would say that we, to the Deputy Mayor's point, you know, looking at all the ways that we can do this and continue to preserve those important protections for families and make sure that they're aware of information that might be shared and comfortable with it. I think that's really important to maintain that connection to the school. And I feel very positive that we are making headway with, you know, our current leadership across agencies and with the Deputy Mayor's support. So we're feeling positive about the collaboration with CFSA.
I see we've been joined by Councilmember Henderson. I'm going to ask a few more questions to CFSA and then I'll turn to you, Councilmember. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I've been on for almost 20 minutes now. Just hanging out.
You know, that's a council member saying that she has some questions she wants to ask.
Put me on a clock. I have one round and then I got to skedaddle.
Your questions are always excellent. Not above excellent. So why don't you proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's still morning, so good morning to everyone who is here today. I wasn't able to be on, I guess, at the first start, so I missed Rashida and Will's testimony, but I have looked at it. I just have a few questions. And I actually want to focus in on sort of what's happening this school year as opposed to looking backwards. Dr. Grant, you shared a little bit of the preliminary numbers in terms of what we're seeing this school year. In terms of the rate for in-seat attendance, 85% across the district, does that include both those students who are attending in-person and virtual? So that is a combined number?
First, good morning, Councilmember Henderson. And yes, that includes all instances of how a child is learning in person or distance.
Okay. And I'm curious, and I guess this is more or less a question for the LEAs, so I guess I'll start with you, Dr. Maestera. I had a conversation earlier this week with the Student Advisory Committee of the State Board of Education, and there's a student there who is an online student this semester and in high school. And he shared that at the beginning of the semester, it was a little bit chaotic in terms of folks getting schedules or sort of the routine and logging on and all of those different pieces. I'm curious, what happened in those early days in terms of how you all tracked the virtual students as you all were still trying to work out the kinks of the program? Was it just, we didn't really, key anybody in, or we said everybody was present, even though we know that we probably missed some people? Was there a date certain where you all started to systematically say, okay, and now we're gonna, log going forward?
Sure, and thank you, Councilmember Henderson, and good morning as well. So as we started up that program, of course, we started with the scheduling, which is, of course, the foundation of how the instructional content would be delivered. And we did immediately start tracking attendance once schedules were finalized.
When were schedules
Schedules were
finalized?
entered the first week of the school year.
Okay.
So that was that first week period. And I would say broadly, in terms of how we take attendance for any student learning synchronously, we do work to make sure that they are present by having an active acknowledgement on screen or in the chat. If there are challenges with technology, then we have a protocol for that where the student and family can let us know that. And then, the teacher and the school will connect to that family and work to resolve the issues. But again, we did set schedules and start taking attendance within the first week of the school year.
Okay. And Ms. Young, was that a similar situation that happened in the charter space? I know that's harder because I know it's weird. I could just ask DCPS, but I know you have so many LEAs that you kind of have to sort of keep track of. But I'm curious about those early days. Was it an immediate in terms of the virtual keeping in terms of attendance, or did some of the schools have challenges in the beginning?
Some of our schools definitely had challenges in the beginning. We all the way up until October, we're having schools that were not submitting all of their attendance and have reached out to those schools since then to make sure our trigger is 90%, that we're going to flag any school that's not up to 90% in any given month. And of course, by the end of the school year, it needs to be 100%. But in the early days, it was harder because there were so many attendance codes, and there was some confusion in terms of the in-person versus the virtual. So we have, it's gotten better since the beginning of the school year, but we do still have some confusion.
Okay. And have you guys followed up with those LEAs for whom you're looking at the data and you're like, that's not right, or we're missing huge chunks in what's going on here, to do some corrective work there?
Yes, we definitely are. It's ongoing. So each month within, I'd say about the 3 to 4 days in which they needed to submit attendance for the previous month. We take a look at the data, and if there are schools that are not reporting or the data looks unusual, we'll reach out to those schools and make sure that there's not a data quality issue, or to make sure that they're connected with their OSSI liaison that's there to help them with technical support for submitting.
Okay. Dr. Grant, we've already been through, I guess, what, term one or semester one ended when, November, I want to say, maybe.
We're going to close up the end of the first semester.
Okay.
Shortly.
Have you all started preliminary looking at the number of students who had to be coded as out for in-person due to COVID or quarantine?
Yes, I was listening to the exchange and wanted to frame that this year we set up attendance policies that set out coding for all states of student learning. So students who are in person, in seat, and then students who are in a distance posture. We have coding for students who are full remote. So they are in an approved virtual learning program that has been either approved by the Public School Charter Board, or they're an existing charter that already had the model. Mm-hmm. And then we have students who can be coded for what we call situational remote. They are on quarantine, they have symptoms. And so the work has been operationalizing those codes across the schools. And we can now see in my testimony, I framed that roughly 1,100 of our 93,000 students are currently coded as some aspect of situational learning. And that is an improvement from last year's coding process to this year, because hopefully over time, we will be able to then better understand what learning environments our students are learning in. And then what's important, I think, for all of us is, are there any learnings we have around academic outcomes connected to the environment with which a student is learning in? Because there has been a lot of conversation about distance learning, but not a lot of conversation about high quality distance learning that would ensure that students are getting access to quality instruction. And so we are excited that we can actually see those numbers now.
Well, let me tease out that 1,100. So is that 1,100 students who have had a situational code since the start of the school year?
That's on a given day. And so we see.
Okay, so now, so a better question is, how many students since the start of the school year have at least had one situational code?
We will run that data and respond back to you. That is a good question.
Okay, because I think that at least in my sort of double hat efforts, right? Obviously, I sit on the committee of the whole, sit on the committee on health. We've been doing a lot of work in terms of vaccines and wanting kids to be healthy. And we get pushback, or we've gotten pushback in terms of vaccine mandates, those types of things. But if we can show in our data how many of our children have had to quarantine or have missed in-person instruction at some point in just one term, or how many of those have been out multiple times, right? Because I hear the anecdotes of, as soon as my kid gets off one quarantine, they go back to school the next day and then they're out again. For people to understand what we're talking about here in terms of the importance of public health from a community standpoint and how it impacts student learning overall. I can't imagine what the disruption is like for a classroom teacher, where you're getting into a stride, then you get a notice, everybody got quarantine. And now I have to pivot whatever my lesson plan was to now being online for 14 days, where there could have been internet challenges. Somebody didn't have a device. Somebody, the house is not stable enough for someone to hear a full instruction, et cetera. And then I come back in person in 2 weeks and I realized that not everybody grasped whatever the concept was that I was teaching those 2 weeks because of all the external environmental things that were happening. I feel like one of the things, at least I hear from parents a lot too, or advocates, in terms of how can we use the data to better inform and improve our practice overall? But also I'm thinking about how can we use the data to move behavior. So those people who are on the, vaccine, we don't need this, that, third, blah, 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 whatever, they're being extreme, they're doing blah, da, da, da. Let's just say what happened and how this has impacted kids. Is that something that we can do here? Because I mean, anecdotes is fine, but I think, 1,100 on any given day, that's one thing. But if you come back and say to us that 5,000 students have been out at some point this year for a situational code, and of that 5,000, 2,000 of them have had more than 2 outs for situational or whatever it is. I think we can have a better conversation about what we need to do going forward in the new year to better protect students, but also to help in terms of supporting what's happening inside the classroom.
So first, I want to underscore the chairman's, your framing and questions are like, you saw a lot of nodding. I think you are speaking all of our collective thoughts. That is one of the reasons why it was critically important for us to have multiple codes so that we actually could draw those through lines. I'd say a couple of things. One, it's critically important for everyone across the District of Columbia to get vaccinated, including our children. It is one of the most important ways of ensuring our schools remain open and safe. Two, we have worked really, really hard across DCPS and the charters to be very clear in their continuous education plans that students have access to instruction regardless of their learning modality. Three, we will be administering statewide assessments this year. And that through line is directly connected to the questions that you are raising, that we will be able to say X amount of students had, it's the same through line we see in this report around the trends we see for at-risk learners, or the trends we are able to see if a 9th grade student repeats 9th grade, or the impact of mobility on attendance. As we get through this year, we will then be able to say students who learned full-time remote, what were their learning outcomes? Students who were impacted through COVID one time or twice, what were their learning outcomes? Those through lines are not just going to inform our practice next year, but I do actually think they're going to be a part of our new normal in terms of the impact of this. Broader conversations are around the learning standards and environments we would expect to have for children learning virtually. And all of that is a through line to this very dynamic state that we're in.
Okay, but are you guys as a oversight of all of the LEAs and frankly, I'll go a step further and I'll add Dr. Mystera to this in terms of oversight over what's happening in your schools. Are y'all doing pop-ups to make sure, so like, I know what the continuing education plan says in terms of every student should be able to have access to something happening in terms of virtual, but we also know anecdotally, some kids are getting a packet and that's it. Or you're getting enough material for one day and not for 14, or 5 days and not for 14. And so what is the level of like looking in to ensure, and I know you can't be everywhere, at every time in any given place, but I'm a trust but verify. So how are we verifying that this is actually happening for kids who happen to be in these situations where they're having to take virtual instruction?
So I'll quickly answer and then defer to Dr. Mystera. So I am a trust but verify. And so part of the operationalizing of the codes and the COVID testing guidance, I've sought to visit a school every single week. And there's some of the things that I highlighted in my testimony that in some of our adult charters, you are seeing this hybrid approach. You are seeing teachers operationalize teaching groups of children who are at home for quarantine and doing direct instruction for their students. The question is, how do we ensure that teachers have the capacity to continue to do that if we find ourselves in the state? So the trust but verify is happening, but it's far more in a feedback loop to hear from LEAs around how they're making it all work. I would then defer to Dr. Mystera on the broader aspect of the question as it relates to DCPS.
Yes, thank you, Superintendent Grant. So we are also a trust and verify. Definitely both. And I would say in answer to your question, Councilmember Henderson, that is one of the real strengths of our cluster support model. We have dedicated teams across all content areas, attendance, education, technology, instruction, special education, who have that specific caseload of schools as a cohort, and then of course supported by the instructional superintendent, who is ultimately accountable and responsible for making sure that continuity of education is occurring. So we have a lot of different walkthrough cycles, cross checks. We also look within our systems to make sure that all of the course companions that teachers are expected to create are updated and available that our blended learning applications also are being used to supplement during the time that a student might be situationally remote. And then again, we have the kind of boots on ground walkthrough to make sure across all of these key operational areas that what we have laid out as expectations is happening. And if it's not, that we understand why, because we know that all of our schools are 100% committed to this work during this very challenging time, and have so much appreciation for that. And we also know how hard it is. So we want to make sure we understand if something's not working, so that from the central services team, we can support resolution.
I've used my graceful 15 minutes, and I do have to run to another meeting. So I really appreciate this. I am, Dr. Grant, going to follow up with you on this point, because I don't feel like we can wait till the end of the school year to look back and use that data. I think that we need to, we got to do this sort of check-in pieces now, if we're going to get to the point of where we need to be by the end of the year. But thank you all so much for your testimony and for being here today.
Thank you, Councilmember. I understand that Mr. Henderson is going to have to leave. I do have one question for him. Your testimony was focused on the issue of in-seat attendance, but I wanted to ask you with regard to feedback. So your school should be making referrals to CFSA when kids have too many unexcused absences, and you also are reporting attendance data. Are you getting the kind of feedback with regard to CFSA referrals, or the kind of access to attendance data that you need?
I may need to get some specific answers from my attendance counselors to answer you most clearly, but my sense is that we are able to make contact with CFSA as we need to. I think that there is when one of the things that my team has shared that is problematic is it's not the connectivity or getting the front end of the communication with CFSA established. It's the tail end when the contacts are completed, understanding what the finality of the outcomes that after they met with those students and families was that we struggle to get the answers from. But I can get some more specifics from my team about that to you after this is over.
If you would. And then with regard to data on attendance, of course, you would be providing that data. I don't know if you provide it directly to OSSI or you provide it to the PCSB, which provides it to OSSI. But to the extent that you want to access it, and I guess it's a dashboard, do you know whether that's everything you want it to be?
I'm not exactly sure that I understand your question. Are you saying, can we access our students' attendance data? Is that,
Well,
I'm not
you
sure
should be able to access the data that you keep.
Of course, right.
Apparently, the data then ends up in a, what do I want to call it, a database that can be manipulated in the sense of doing queries and getting answers in different ways. I mean, it may be that you don't know or that it's satisfactory. That's what I'm really trying to find out.
Yeah, this is what you're referencing earlier when you asked Superintendent Grant about CLIC, I believe. So let me follow up with that and make sure that and get you an answer about whether or not my team finds that sufficient.
Okay. All right, that would be helpful. I don't think I'm going to have any other questions for you. So if you need to go, sorry, everybody else, we still have to stay. But Mr. Henderson, if you need to go, you can. If you could provide a copy of your statement, please do.
Yes, I believe that's coming your way momentarily, actually. So
okay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer questions down the road to anyone as well. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
So I wanted to ask some more questions of Ms. Muffalito about CFSA's process. You mentioned in your testimony that on a weekly basis, that staff from any LEA has access to the supervisor of educational neglect triage unit.
That's correct.
Do you know how many LEAs take advantage of that?
I don't have an exact number. I can get that information back to you, but it's my understanding that on any given day when we have the office hours, we do have LEAs dropping in and asking questions of the supervisor and providing consults.
And this is LEAs, not the individual schools. So it'd be-
No, it is, I'm sorry, I misspoke. It is the individual schools. It's open to everyone.
okay, so it's open to everyone. So do you have a sense, is it like the phone's ringing off the hook, or there are like 2 calls a week?
It's my understanding that in each session, there has been robust conversations. I don't have an exact number, but like I said, I can try and get that information to you.
Okay, if you would, please.
No problem.
And then you also testified on a monthly basis, we hold monthly check-in meetings with representatives from DCPS and DCPCSB to discuss attendance data. I'm assuming that's all with upper level staff, am I correct?
Yes.
And the reason why I ask is because that weekly office hours, I think, sounds constructive. The check-in meetings, I think it's important that you're getting feedback from the ground up, if you will, if I can call a principal the ground up, as opposed to from the upper echelons of an LEA. I'm pausing for a reaction from you.
No, I understand. I totally understand where you're coming from. That's why we implemented this school year, those office hours, so that we could get the feedback and information from the people on the ground doing the work.
Okay.
And that's why those sessions are held weekly. And then we have a larger conversation with the leaders monthly.
I'd like to take a couple minutes for you to explain the process, because I think there's misunderstanding with regard to these referrals.
Okay.
School refers a kid for missing, I can't remember, I think it's 10 days of school. CFSA doesn't immediately launch a full investigation. Am I correct?
That is correct.
And in fact, you have, it used to be called a differentiated response. And for these referrals from the schools, I'm assuming it's your lowest level response.
So we do not have differential response at CFSA any longer. We just have one response, which is investigations. However, what we do have is what we call our educational neglect triage unit, which is an extended arm of our hotline. And so when we receive the referrals for educational neglect, we have a team of dedicated family support workers that triage those referrals. And what that work looks like is reaching back out to the reporter and to the school to see what the concerns are, and then also reaching out to the family to see what barriers are preventing their child from attending school regularly. And we try to triage that through community resources. We only launch an sorry.
What does that mean? Triage that through community resources.
So a lot of times, certain things that are impacting attendance could be food insecurities, transportation, clothing. And so we really work with community-based providers to try and link families to services to improve absenteeism.
That speaks to why I think the feedback to the school is important.
Understood.
So principal knows that kids missing school because of food insecurity in the home.
And we do relay that information back to the reporting source. And it's assumed that the reporting source is then going to provide that information to the leaders in the school if there's a significant issue that the school needs to address. That's part of the triage program.
Yeah, and as I said before in my last round, I didn't think that that's working very well. So you don't call this a differentiated response, but this triage, they're not doing they're doing an investigation in lay terms, but they're not doing an investigation in CFSA terms, correct?
Correct.
And you said they're checking with the family to see what's going on, as well as the school to find out what the school understands. And then providing some assistance to the family if that's necessary.
Yes.
So if I ask you, and I am going to ask you for how many cases are referred and how many are sustained as educational neglect, that number won't reflect how many cases where you identified a problem and addressed it, like helping them with food or clothing.
So I do have data specific to the number of referrals that we've triaged and the number of referrals that turned into investigations. Is that, would you like some of that? Okay. So as of 12/4, we have had 988 referrals made to our portal. Of those 988, 152 turned into, hold on, I want to make sure I'm reporting correctly. 152 of those were COVID-19 related issues. And then of the 988, the 836 that were non-COVID related. I'm sorry, repeat the question. I have a lot of data in front of me. I want to make sure that I'm giving you the correct information.
Well, you were going to give me the number of referrals and how many resulted in investigations.
Yep. Okay, so total reports to the portal are 988. 836 were non-COVID related reports. 152 were COVID-19 related reports. And we have screened in 133 of those reports for investigation that are ed neglect non-COVID, and screened in that are COVID-19 only related is 81. We currently have 98 that are being triaged right now.
So if I do the math correctly, 214 are being investigated. That's 133 plus 81.
130, yes.
And as of today, or as of December 4th, there hasn't been a conclusion to those investigations?
There have been, some of those investigations have been closed. Of those, there have been 24 families that have been substantiated for educational neglect, but none of those families were COVID-19 related issues.
And it was educational neglect, not abuse and neglect.
So the data that I have in front of me is related to that at least one of the allegations that were substantiated was for educational neglect. There could have been additional issues in the home that were attributing to the educational neglect.
You just confused me. 24 were substantiated.
Right, they could have had multiple allegations, but one of the allegations was educational neglect. So it could be that we went into the home to investigate ed neglect, and we found other safety concerns in the home.
Yes. And how many found other safety concerns?
I don't have that exact number.
So the 24 is?
The 24 is at least one of the allegations that the family was substantiated for was educational neglect. And we can do a deeper dive and provide you that information.
I'd be interested.
Certainly.
That gets at the delinquency concerns. Now that's all for this year.
Yes.
There's been some concern that CFSA is being overwhelmed by these referrals. But your testimony said that there were 4 additional FTEs now?
Yes, we're very happy to report that we have been gifted 4 additional FTEs for resource development specialists who will help us with our community work, engaging families and assessing the need for services to prevent them from coming into investigations.
So I'm not hearing you say, oh yes, this is overwhelming and we need to reduce the number.
reduce the number of
Refer.
reports.
Yeah.
At this time, we're managing the referrals through the triage unit and our investigation staff.
Now, let me ask you this, and this may be my last question of you. From time to time, I will be told of a student, a child who, some of the numbers are mind-boggling, missed 120 days of school. Now, I guess maybe it's unfair if I say, why isn't that educational neglect? But it seems to me that that speaks to a much more serious circumstance. I'm not really sure what my question is. Are those cases coming to you? Have they already come to you and gone beyond that? What can we be doing?
So the Office of the Attorney General handles the truancy cases for those children that are 14 to 17. We, at this time, it hasn't been brought to my attention that any child has missed 154 days of school. We generally do see that towards the end of the school year. And sometimes it's not reported to us until the end of the school year, which of course is problematic. But whenever we do see those numbers, obviously we address that with the family to see what else is going on in the home that would cause such absenteeism. And yes, it is very concerning for us as an agency.
Unfortunately, my question is not more specific, so I think I'll leave it at that. I do want to go back to the 24. Of the 24 that were substantiated, how many of those were any of those referred to CFSA outside of this process of the school's reporting?
No, not that I'm aware of, but that again is something that I can check into.
Okay, if you would.
Yep.
Dr. Grant, your report, the OSCE report on truancy, broke down the data by month, but not by ward. Why not by ward?
It can be broken down by ward. You can follow up if that is a data point you would like to see.
I think there's some value in that, even though we're changing the ward boundaries. I think there's some value to that.
Noted. Yeah, it was one of the part of the testimony. We did see this like anomaly in Ward 7 around like their learning posture, but we didn't want to opine because it was just an anomaly. But we can break the data down across wards and share that back out with you and your team.
Ms. Muffaletto noted, and I think others did, that the absenteeism and truancy is highest at the end of the year. Are there strategies that you're looking at that we can address that?
I put on both my hats. At the state level, the strategy is ensuring, as we kind of discussed here, that schools can see their data on a month-to-month basis so they can actually see the trends. I'd say it has to be a collective community effort at the school level. You see it play out in your life. The first day of school is exciting and everyone's taking pictures and posting on Instagram, and there's so much excitement around it, but no one is outside of kindergarten. In kindergarten, we celebrate the 100th day of school. But outside of that, you don't tend to see in the spring months the level of energy around making sure children are still engaged and excited and being told, come to school. And I think I will defer to Dr. Mycera on like what happens at the LEA level to ensure excitement and engagement in the spring. At OSCE, we are trying to make sure we're standing up incentives and resources for LEAs to continue to have robust offerings for schools in the spring. But we see the trend, we do see that trend, as you have noticed, that as the school year goes on, we see truancy rates rise. But I will pause for a second and allow Dr. Mycera to weigh in.
Thank you, Superintendent Grant, yes, I think that is a challenge as you laid out. And it is really down to the work of each school community to make sure that we're focused on maintaining that engagement and excitement around learning and also around belonging in each school community. So we certainly focus on that. And Chairman, I know we've talked about our annual school support plans that we create that do include attendance incentives and best practices. And then the instructional superintendent for each of their clusters works with each school leader to really stay laser-like focused on the attendance efforts and trends again through the systems I've described today. Additionally, this year we have launched a system-wide attendance intervention work group where we're bringing together representatives from all levels, central office, schools, attendance points of contact in specific schools to really think through and be creative and innovative around particularly chronic absence, which we know we've seen an uptick in as described. And so we're putting together a kind of targeted group to look at this and prepare for those trends that we see in the spring. And then also just to note that we did not talk significantly about fall readiness and school opening, but as Superintendent Grant just spoke to, having a strong start, we know with attendance is critical, and we often can see, within the first month of the school year, we can predict which students might begin to engage just on those early patterns. And I think you mentioned that as well, Chairman. So we spent a significant amount of time to really work to re-engage families, re-engage students, knowing that this transition to in-person learning is even more significant after the year away. Starting in the summer, sending very targeted welcome letters to students where we had seen some challenges last spring, increasing and expanding our home visit efforts this summer and early fall. And then last, holding a series of parent universities to help parents prepare for the transition of coming back. And so we feel that those early efforts really helped us anchor in, this focus of sustained energy around attendance moving forward.
I'm not hearing anything specific. Let me ask Deputy Mayor Kine. And I'm going to actually read the question. We know that we need to do something different to reverse the truancy trend and to bring down chronic absenteeism. And we need to do it by more than 1% here or there every year. What do we do differently?
Thanks, Chairman. There's a lot that we're doing differently, and I think we all bring an appropriate degree of humility to answering this very complicated question. But if you look across our recovery investments for this year, I think you'll see literally millions and millions of dollars expended in ways that are at least in part designed to improve our attendance and reduce chronic absenteeism, starting with some of the work Dr. Maestero was talking about, which was our back to school campaign, where we were working to remove some of what we see as the systemic barriers to attendance across the city, which included this year, unfortunately, a lot of potential fear on the part of families about coming back to in-person learning. So I think in the first instance, we cannot undervalue the very specific money that was spent to make our schools safe and to ensure we communicated that safety and the measures we're taking to families to make sure they were comfortable having their students return, to the point now where you've heard very robust general attendance and very robust enrollment generally. Secondly, we know it's critical that we work to provide the kinds of wraparound services that actually help ensure consistent attendance on the part of students. This includes things that relate to school safety and safety in the community. So all of our youth safety work, including our Safe Blocks work, which we've stood up, the work that we've done on transportation and our microtransit pilot, for example, and others are all designed to provide the wraparound services. We've beefed up our mental health support services for families, in addition to schools and school communities, all of which is at least in part designed to ensure kids are feeling well and well enough to be in school. We've done some specific investments around attendance work this year as part of our recovery. So we've talked about in these hearings before the critical nature of engaging families and giving them vital information, particularly information on a comparative basis. So we call this our kind of nudge work. So we help families understand how their kids are doing in terms of attendance and what that attendance looks like compared to other students. And that has a proven track record of bolstering attendance across our schools. So we've expanded that nudge work and that family communication. So there's a number of very specific things that we're doing.
Ms. Young, is the Charter School Board doing anything in addition to what Deputy Mayor Kine mentioned?
Sure. So one of our strategies over the years has been providing spaces for schools to share what they're doing, to share best practices. This past October at our charter leaders meeting, we invited the school admin of a campus that had really strong attendance last year to come and speak to other LEAs. So they came and shared some of the strategies that had worked well for their school. And we also, for the past couple of charter leaders meetings, have had breakout sessions by grade bands where schools could share freely about what was working and what was not working, and attendance generally would come up. Last year, we also sent communications to a number of schools, about a little over 20 schools. We sent communications to their board chair and school leaders, letting them know that their truancy rates were very high, asking them what their strategies were for the remainder of the school year and moving forward. So we received communications from those schools on what they were trying to employ to have to do things differently. So our approach has been a very school by school touch points and nudging to try to allow them to share, but also to make sure that they're aware if their data looks different than other schools.
Ms. Young, a couple of years ago, I was very intrigued with testimony from you or one of your colleagues at PCSB. There are a couple of schools that were doing buses. Is that still happening?
So yeah, I think it was maybe 3 years ago, we looked at the schools that had transportation. It's a rather small number overall. At the time, there were 9 schools that had responded that they used buses, and 5 of those 9 had submitted data to us so that we could dig into whether the private transportation that the schools were providing was having an impact on student attendance. And at the time, we found that for a handful of those schools, we saw much better attendance for students who were accessing buses. For a few schools, there was minimally better attendance, and for one school, we didn't see much improvement at all. So it wasn't something that we felt was a silver bullet in terms of this is the answer. But again, for a handful of those schools, we did see improved attendance. We have not polled the school since then. Anecdotally, I do know that some schools that once provided bus service prior to the pandemic have paused. But in terms of whether that number is greatly higher or lower than the 9 it was a few years ago, that's something that we would still need to find out.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Kine, how's the microbus program working? And are you doing that only at DCPS, or is that charters as well?
So that's for all public schools in our in the identified safe passage areas in wards 7 and 8. So it's 24 schools altogether, both DCPS and charter. And I would say it is working extremely well in schools where the school leadership has gotten on board and worked with the Department of For-Hire Vehicles and families to advertise it and get the program circulating. We have had a couple of challenges at some schools where we haven't been able to sign up the number of students that we have available slots for. And so we continue to work on identifying what the specific worries or challenges are for those schools. We don't yet have data on the relationship between that program, Chairman, and attendance. So we're continuing to to look for ways to analyze that, to be able to know what the overall impact of this program is on attendance, along with obviously mitigation of some of the youth safety concerns that drove the implementation of it.
So there are 24 schools and a few of them are under enrolled, so to speak, in the microbus program.
Correct.
And we can anecdotally think that this helps with attendance, but that has not been analyzed.
That's correct. I do have some other news on transportation, Chairman, which may get ahead of one of your questions, but you'll recall we've talked in these hearings before about our Every Ride Counts pilot study that we did for families experiencing homelessness, where we provided gas money or car share credit for a couple of weeks as those families were going through transitions. And I'm sorry to report that those two interventions had no impact on attendance rates.
You said 2 interventions. Every Ride Counts was 1 intervention.
The 2 interventions or 2 so-called treatments within the study were the families either received gas credit or gas money for gas, or they received ride share credits. And
neither of those, there was some analysis done and neither of those affected attendance.
Correct. This was analysis done by the lab at DC.
Why would it not affect attendance?
I don't know. But we were hopeful that these kinds of interventions would actually help improve attendance for that specific population, which of course were families experiencing homelessness and that were part of the short-term housing program that we've got, but we did not see improvement in the attendance of their students in ways that we hoped.
Well, do you not know why it didn't succeed because you just don't have that in front of you or because it wasn't analyzed? In other words, if I say, can you get back to me on why? Is there an answer there?
No, there is no answer. That we would be speculating because you can imagine the way the study is done. We provide the intervention and track the outcome we're interested in, which in this case was attendance. It did not involve the kind of ethnographic work which would have involved surveys or interviews with families to try to understand why they were not changing their behaviors. But it's a very difficult question to answer. But this particular study simply focused on those treatments and that outcome measure.
Well, I hate to say it, but I feel like this is Monday morning quarterbacking, but that understanding why could be very, very useful. I mean, it may be that the homeless families simply weren't interested in attendance. And so providing transportation just didn't do anything about that fundamental problem. We assume that kids aren't attending school where transportation is involved. No, we assume that homeless families who are very, transitional mobile, that they have a transportation problem and that therefore providing transportation, they'll go to school. And knowing why that didn't work seems to me to be kind of important because it says then what strategy would work, which could be that, may get us back to CFSA actually, educational neglect, that the parents just aren't interested in the kid going to school.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And that was not the study that was done. And remember, none of these things can be comprehensive. So we were asking the equally important question, would additional support and resourcing for transportation improve the attendance of the students in those families? And the answer in this particular study, which had its limitations, was no, it would not. And we think that's also a very important piece of information to have. Now, of course, it raises, as usual, these kinds of studies always raise 10 or 15 other important questions, to your point.
Let me go back to Ms. Young for a couple of questions. The law requires that charter schools have to have student support teams or SSTs as kids accumulate unexcused absences. Am I correct? That applies to charters?
Yes, correct.
Are you finding that some of the charter schools are struggling with doing the SSTs?
So the schools do self-report their SSTs. So last year they reported that a little over 7,000 charter school students met with an SST for the 2021 school year. So they also shared some of the barriers to implementing recommendations of the SSTs. Not holding the SSTs, but the recommendations. In terms of barriers to SST having the meeting in the first place, we did not collect data from all schools on that, but we have heard schools share that making the time for all those meetings, having all the staff members participate, having the students attend, sometimes family members attend, that it is just logistically difficult. So that's what we have heard in the past. But again, a little over 7,000 last year.
Dr. Maestera, my understanding is that some DCPS schools are overwhelmed by the SSTs. Have you looked at strategies to deal with this? Maybe I should say a little bit more.
Yes.
Put this to
Sorry.
Ms. Young as well, and that is, I think the idea behind the SST, the student support team, is an excellent idea. So a kid misses, I forget what it is, I'm going to say 5 days, yeah, unexcused. There's reason to be concerned because why do we want to get to 10 days in a report to CFSA? So we bring together, may not be the principal, but somebody senior at the school, as well as counselor, as well as the student, as well as the family, the parent or parents, and talk about what's going on. I think it's an excellent idea. If there are so many SSTs that a school can't physically do it, that's a problem too. So what's the answer here? I don't think the answer is to get rid of the SSTs, but what's the answer? Dr. Maestera, you want to take first crack and then I'll ask Ms. Young?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Mendelson. And I know we have spoken about this over the years, that, that challenge of the volume is real, and agreed that the wraparound meeting and, that early problem solving and intervention planning is also critical, as I spoke to earlier. At DCPS, what we have done, and I meant to touch on this earlier as something that is a new and expanded approach, is really looked at creating a way for that intervention to occur at the 5-day mark, of course, in accordance with requirements, but make it a little bit different. So what we have now is kind of a two-pronged approach. At 5 days, we have what we're calling a student attendance conference, which is a direct touch point with between the attendance counselor, the parent, and the student, him or herself, if they are, if it's age appropriate, to really understand as quickly and timely as possible what might be happening to prevent attendance. At the same time, we have integrated our attendance data into our multi-tiered system of support process. So through that process, what that looks like is that our MTSS team, which is the team in the school that really looks at all of the data from a whole child lens, attendance, behavior, and academics across all children in the school on a weekly basis. And looking at that attendance measure, considering also ways that attendance might be bubbling up as a warning sign, and then pulling the information from the student attendance conference into that larger conversation. And what we're excited about too is that the dashboard I described earlier, DDAC, allows us to capture the information that we learn about from the family, from the student attendance conferences, and pull it in so that the leadership team of the MTSS process can immediately see what we've learned at a glance. And we're able to then use that MTSS process to determine what additional attendance interventions are needed. Again, starting with the 5-day mark, but then when we look at what's happening by day 10, do we need to have a more targeted plan for that student? Again, attendance being one of the 3 areas that we look at So rather than having that isolated conversation and planning happening outside of a larger support process, we've now pulled it in to our larger student support process. And we're really excited about that development. We think it's really going to have an impact on our outcomes.
So I followed, but I didn't completely follow. So you said a two-pronged approach, and one is a student attendance conference, which was
Yes.
student, the attendance counselor, and you mentioned a third.
The student could be included if they are age appropriate, but the parent and the attendance counselor have that early huddle to essentially
Okay.
understand what's happening. And then
So
concurrently,
That's still like an SST.
Exactly. It's a streamlined SST that allows us, as you said earlier, to address the issue of capacity, so that we're able to use these vehicles together to really understand quickly, again, within the required timeline, which is 2 days after the child hits that fifth unexcused absence. By that point, we need to start to engage with the family and understand what's happening. And then by day 10, we have another look and we say through the MTSS process, how are we doing? Once we do this 5-day intervention, is this child's attendance improving? Are we still seeing the challenge? And then at day 10, that MTSS team will say, maybe we need a broader, deeper intervention plan as tier 2 of the MTSS process, which again is that those tiers in MTSS. As you know, tier 1 is what we do for all students. Tier 2 is what we do for more targeted support, maybe groups of students. And then tier 3 is that really deep individualized support. So we're pulling in attendance data and that information we glean from that first conference into that larger MTSS process this year for the first time.
And the MTSS process is for faculty at the school?
Exactly. So we have an MTSS leadership team that meets weekly. And then we have that team is, cross-functional, includes educators, the school leadership, educators, and counselors, social work support staff as well. And then that team together looks at the data as I shared and determines if a deeper plan is needed. And again, attendance being one of the 3 areas that we examine through we have a system called Panorama, which pulls that data in from DDAC. And so you see everything at a glance for a child, which is super exciting and powerful in terms of how to use data holistically to drive planning and improvement.
And the weekly MTSS conference is not limited to one student. It's all the students who are getting to, and that's at day 10.
Correct. The weekly MTSS leadership meeting occurs to look at all students, all data, but with respect to attendance, we pull in the data for students who have those 5 unexcused absences where we're holding the student attendance conference. That data, the results of that conference essentially become available for additional review by that leadership team. And then we look at, again, do we see this trend continue at day 10? That is a trigger to say we might need a deeper intervention, a more holistic intervention than what we put together at the student attendance conference.
Ms. Young, so how are the charters or the PCSB dealing with this volume challenge?
Well, from an LEA level, and of course, I can't speak to one approach that all the LEAs are taking to figure out the volume issue, but from the schools that we've invited to share out how they are handling attendance, we have heard holding attendance meetings more frequently. One school holds them twice a week, and then they're able to look at the students, all of the data as a whole. And that can allow the school to come up with strategies for batches of students before it gets to that 5-day point. So really lowering the number of students that will need an SST is one of the mitigation forms. Other schools have just talked about strengthening their internal data review process as a whole, and using that data to come up with more individualized like solutions for each student, whether that's robocalls to wake those students up or whatever the data is showing a student might need in order to get to school. So it is, although the strategy might be to look at data, okay, what are we going to do with the students who are showing these indicators tends to be different based on the age of the student, the school, their model. But I guess the one commonality is looking at data more frequently.
Thank you. I have some questions for Ms. Garcia. Do you think that Show Up Stand Out is as effective as want it to be?
So we have talked in the past that the ongoing challenge with the program is the engagement rate around families who choose to engage in services upon referral. That engagement rate is about this year, thus far, it's 18%, and it's in line with the past several years where that's been on average across all the CBOs, 20%. At the same time, what we do continue to see in the data is that for families that are referred, even if they do not engage with services, at least this was pre-pandemic, more than 70% of the students are not re-referred in subsequent years. And so even that touch point of being made aware that there is something going on with their student may have that positive effect in terms of not accruing 5 or more unexcused absences in subsequent years. So we are working consistently with the CBOs, and the CBOs are trying multiple different strategies to try and increase those engagement rates with families. But that is still one of the challenges that we see at that SUSO level, with where the engagement is with the parent or guardian, that there is a variety of reasons why that engagement rate stays that low. In some cases, it is the CBOs are unable to actually make contact with the families. That may be attributable to not having up-to-date contact information. The family has moved, the family has become homeless or housing unstable. It may be just the inability to make a connection. The family never returns a call. In some cases, the families are declining because there is a concern that we are actually representatives of either Cfsa or court social services, and there is an unwillingness to engage in those systems. So the engagement rate is the piece that we've talked about for years, and that we are continuously trying different strategies to try and enhance.
And you said that over 70% of the students are not referred in subsequent years. Is that 70% of the students who engaged?
It's of the students who are referred. So of the students who are referred, and it's in the immediate following year. So in the subsequent year, they are not re-referred.
So that's of the total number of referrals, but of the total number of referrals, only 18% actually engage with the CBO.
That is this year's rate as of December 3rd. So, but it is in line with previous years, which have hovered at an average of about 20%.
So remind me why we don't require participation as opposed to it being voluntary.
So one, OVSJG has no mechanism in which to require families to participate. And my understanding of the genesis of the program was to in fact offer that voluntary opportunity before families were referred to systems in which it wasn't voluntary participation, whether that was Cfsa or court social services, because we recognize that touches to those systems alone can increase the risk factor, particularly for those youth of later juvenile delinquency or juvenile justice system involvement. And so if we were to try somehow to implement a mechanism of requiring or mandating or enforcing families to participate, we would in many ways just be replicating the exact same systems that the program was designed to try and deter contact with in the first place.
I didn't follow that. So I don't know why it's a bad thing to have contact with CFSA. I realize there's some stigma about referrals to CFSA, but if CFSA is doing the job it's doing, which is to just look and see whether there's abuse and neglect. But this is about Show Up Stand Out, and which works with community-based organizations. So show up, stand out SUSO is not in every school, but in the schools it's in, if it's voluntary, we're just not going to get the participation. And that's really what you're 80%. And that means that 80% of kids are not having contact with a community-based organization. That's not the same as CFSA.
No, that's correct. But and I agree with you that I don't think a contact with CFSA is in itself negative or problematic, but I can tell you that there is a perception by families that it is a system they don't actively want to be involved in or seek to be involved in.
I understand, but the Far Southeast Collaborative is not the same as CFSA.
Right, and that is absolutely the point of having the CBOs be in that role. But there is still a perception by many families. We hear this from folks who are either declining or from the CBOs themselves, that because this body has access to information about their student, that they are thereby an extension of one of these systems. And so they are reluctant or hesitant to engage with those systems, even if it is a community-based organization. And so many of our efforts over the past several years, and we have been increasing the efforts with the schools, and particularly the leadership in the schools who have those relationships with families, with parents and guardians, to try and have a vouching effect for those CBOs to try and make clear and make a distinction that, yes, this is a resource that the school supports, that we offer, that we encourage you to take, to engage in these services to the benefit of your family and of your student.
I'm just thinking of the cost benefit analysis, and if we can bring services to these kids who are missing a lot of school, that's a good thing, but we're afraid to require it because there's perception of stigma that this just seems kind of defeating. 2 years ago when you testified, Ms. Garcia, you testified that data sharing efforts between your agency and other agencies, not just OSSI, were put on hold. Are there still data issues other than what we talked about earlier with CLIC?
I don't believe there are. Once we had the ability to have access to the CLIC data in OSSI system, it actually resolved some of the challenges that we were having. We do continue to have conversations with DCPS and public charter school boards to just be able to get access to some manipulated, not in a bad way, data to get school level data in a quarterly basis. So we are not facing the same data challenges we have previously. And so thank you to our partners for providing that access.
The attendance data is getting worse rather than better for high schools.
It's getting better. So for students who engage in the high school program, their in-seat attendance is actually higher than non-engaged.
Where they're engaged, but overall. Well, would you say that the high school pilot is working?
Yes, absolutely. And we were actually out of the pilot phase. So we were in the pilot phase for the first 3 years. We're now 2 years out of the pilot phase. Out of the 3 CBOs that were funded in the pilot, 2 demonstrated successful outcomes. So we have continued to work with them and have actually expanded their programming. As I mentioned in my testimony, not only are they working with high schools, but they've also expanded to work with several feeder middle schools for those high schools. And the outcome data that we have for the high school program is positive, both in terms of students' attitudes, perceptions, and behavior around attendance, as well as what we're seeing around in-seat attendance and unexcused absences for those students who do engage in the programs.
I mentioned stigma with CFSA, and I should have asked Ms. Maffaletto, what is CFSA doing to try to overcome this stigma? And I don't mean in the question that I think that CFSA is a problem, but clearly some folks want to avoid CFSA at all costs. What is CFSA doing to reduce that?
So for especially as it relates to educational neglect, it's not meant to be a punitive process. And I understand what the perception is in the community. And so what CFSA is doing is engaging our community partners and sharing resources to help engage these families with the absentee issues.
Do you think it's working, overcoming the stigma?
I think engaging and educating is the only way that we are going to improve that stigma. And so we are continuing to do that in this endeavor.
Last question, I think, although actually, let me check with staff. Hold on. I'll start with you, Deputy Mayor Kine. What metrics or goals should I hold you to if we are to do another hearing on attendance and truancy in the spring?
I would say we're looking to reduce the chronic absenteeism rate.
So if I have a hearing, let's say in March, the goal is that the metric that I'll hold you to is whether the truancy rate is down,
The chronic absenteeism rate is down.
chronic absenteeism. Now, I don't think I've said this, but give me 2 or 3 achievable metrics. So are you stopping at 1 or can I get a couple more?
I'll stop at 1, Chairman. That's the one that's in my office's performance plan, and it's the one that we work towards. So I'll stick with 1.
Dr. Maestera?
Thank you, Chairman. The 3 that we focus on are the 3 we all discuss regularly: in-seat attendance, truancy, and chronic absence. So I would echo the Deputy Mayor's sentiment in terms of wanting to see chronic absence and truancy go down and ISA increase.
Dr. Grant?
I was just ticking off a list. I will echo the sentiments of my colleagues around seeing the trends decline around chronic absenteeism and truancy, but I will also add in the infrastructure and investments that OSSI is making on our data processes, systems, and collections. And so we are collecting and reporting the data, but conversations that took place today, ensuring that there are strong service options for our LEAs with respect to having access to data and the ways that they can utilize it to inform their practice. We have said and continue to say that we are eager to continue to engage in conversations about our attendance policy overall to make sure that we are producing data that allows LEAs to operationalize their decisions as soon and as fast as possible.
Ms. Young?
Ours is similar. Chronic absenteeism is higher right now than it was in school year 2021 and 1920. So we will be pushing schools to continue to come up with strategies to reduce chronic absenteeism. So that's the metric that we will be paying attention to, in addition to increasing in-seat attendance, which tends to go hand in hand with that metric.
I don't want to leave CFSA out. You're a little different than the others, but what metric or goal should I hold you to for the next hearing?
Sure. So our hope is that by March, we'll have those 4 RDS positions I discussed in my testimony up and running and engaging families in the community to prevent them from being subject to the investigative arm of CFSA.
In just a second. Ms. Garcia?
Working with LEAs and schools to increase the overall number of referrals, as well as working with the CBOs to try and increase the engagement rate.
I think I'll leave it at that. I want to thank all of you for your testimony. I think this is a really important issue, but I think we all have sort of said that as well. So thank you again. Let me just conclude the hearing or wind it down. This has been a hearing on improving school attendance, truancy, and chronic absenteeism issues in the District of Columbia. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. That is anybody, meaning any member of the public who's paying attention to this, who wants to submit testimony can do so. The record closes at 5 p.m. on December 23rd of this year. Thank you all again. The time is 12:58 p.m. and this hearing or roundtable is adjourned.